The morning mist hung heavy over Windsor Great Park as King Charles III stood at the window of his private study, watching the early joggers navigate the ancient pathways that had witnessed centuries of royal drama. His weathered hands, marked by age spots that seemed to have appeared overnight since his mother's passing, gripped a steaming cup of tea. The Earl Grey had grown cold, but Charles barely noticed. His mind was consumed by a decision that would shake the very foundations of the House of Windsor. It was February 2024, and the weight of the crown had never felt heavier. The previous 18 months had been a whirlwind of constitutional duties, public appearances, and private struggles as he adjusted to being monarch rather than heir apparent. But today, the burden pressing down on his shoulders had nothing to do with affairs of state or Commonwealth relations. Today, Charles faced the most difficult family decision of his reign. The secure phone on his mahogany desk buzzed insistently. Sir Clive Alderton, his private secretary, appeared in the doorway with a quiet efficiency that had made him indispensable to the new king. His expression was carefully neutral, but Charles had known him long enough to recognize the tension around his eyes. "Your Majesty, the Prime Minister's office has called again regarding the Prince Andrew situation. They're requesting an urgent meeting this afternoon." Charles set down his cup with a soft clink that seemed to echo in the wood-paneled room. Prince Andrew, his brother, the man who had once been the pride of the Royal Navy, a war hero who had flown helicopters in the Falklands War, risking his life for crown and country. Now, Andrew had become the royal family's greatest liability, a constant source of embarrassment and scandal that threatened to undermine everything Charles was trying to achieve as king. The Jeffrey Epstein Association had been devastating enough, but it was the ongoing Virginia Giuffre case and Andrew's disastrous BBC Newsnight interview that had really sealed his fate. Even after settling the civil case out of court for a reported £12 million, the damage to the monarchy's reputation seemed irreparable. Every public appearance, every royal event, was overshadowed by questions about Andrew's presence and his continued use of royal titles and privileges. Charles walked to his desk and picked up a thick folder marked Confidential Royal Household Matters. Inside were reports from his senior advisors, polling data showing plummeting public support for the monarchy and increasingly urgent communications from government officials. The numbers made for grim reading. Public approval for the royal family had dropped to historic lows, and much of the blame centered on Andrew's continued position within the institution. The king remembered a conversation with his mother just weeks before her death. Queen Elizabeth II had looked frail in her final months, but her mind remained sharp as ever. She had spoken quietly about the difficult decisions that came with wearing the crown, about choosing between personal loyalty and institutional survival. "Sometimes, Charles," she had said, her voice barely above a whisper, "love means making the hardest choice. A monarch's first duty is to the crown, not to family sentiment." At the time, Charles had nodded respectfully, thinking his mother was speaking in general terms about the challenges of leadership. Now he understood she had been preparing him for exactly this moment. The morning progressed with its usual rhythm of briefings and official correspondence, but Charles found it impossible to concentrate. His assistant announced the arrival of his eldest son, William, Prince of Wales, for their scheduled weekly meeting. William entered the room with the purposeful stride that had become his signature since taking on increased responsibilities. At 41, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who knew his destiny, but Charles noticed the lines of concern etched around his son's eyes. "Father, we need to discuss Andrew," William said without preamble, settling into the leather chair across from the king's desk. "The situation has become untenable." Charles appreciated his son's directness. It was a quality that would serve him well as king. "The advisors have been quite clear about their recommendations," Charles replied carefully. William leaned forward, his expression intense. "This isn't just about advisors anymore. Catherine and I were at the children's school sports day yesterday, and even there, parents are asking questions. The other parents, these are people who should be supportive of the monarchy, and they're openly questioning why Andrew still receives royal protection, why he's still living at Royal Lodge. The mention of Royal Lodge sent a sharp pang through Charles's chest. The grand Georgian mansion in Windsor Great Park had been Andrew's home since 2004, a symbol of his status as a senior royal. The 30-room property, with its manicured gardens and rich history, represented everything Andrew had come to expect as his birthright. The children are starting to ask questions too, William continued, referring to his 3 children with Catherine. George is old enough now to understand when his classmates make comments. This is affecting the next generation. Charles stood and walked back to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in a pose that had become habitual during moments of deep contemplation. Outside, life continued its normal pace, but he felt the weight of history pressing down on him. Every decision he made would be scrutinized not just by the public and media, but by future historians who would judge how he had handled this crisis. The irony wasn't lost on him that Andrew had once been considered the Queen's favorite son. Born 12 years after Charles, when Elizabeth was a more confident and experienced mother, Andrew had enjoyed freedoms and indulgences that Charles had never known. While Charles had been groomed for duty from birth, constantly reminded of his future responsibilities, Andrew had been allowed to pursue a military career and enjoy the privileges of royal status without the crushing weight of expectation. Those privileges had come at a cost, though. Andrew had never developed the discipline and judgment that came from knowing every action would be scrutinized. His business associations, his lifestyle choices, his apparent inability to recognize when he was being exploited by those seeking to use his royal connections, all of it had led inevitably to this moment. Sir Clive returned with another update. The media were intensifying their coverage, with several major newspapers running editorials calling for decisive action. Social media was ablaze with criticism not just of Andrew, but of Charles himself for allowing the situation to continue. The hashtag #NoMoreAndrew was trending globally, and Republican movements in several Commonwealth countries were using the scandal to push for the abolition of the monarchy. The Australian Prime Minister's office has sent a formal communication, Sir Clive reported quietly. They're expressing concerns about the impact on the upcoming referendum on Republican government. Charles felt his jaw tighten. Australia had been considering another Republic referendum, and Andrew's ongoing presence in the royal family was providing ammunition for those who wanted to sever ties with the crown. New Zealand had also made subtle inquiries about the monarchy's future direction. The Commonwealth realms that his mother had worked so hard to keep united were beginning to question their continued allegiance. The afternoon brought a visit from the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, whose role as spiritual advisor to the monarch had taken on increased importance during these challenging times. The Archbishop's presence always brought a sense of calm to royal proceedings, but today his usually serene expression carried traces of concern. "Your Majesty," the Archbishop began after they had settled in the comfortable chairs near the fireplace, "I've been reflecting on the principles that guide us in times of moral complexity. The balance between mercy and justice, between family loyalty and public service." Charles appreciated the Archbishop's diplomatic approach, but he sensed there was more direct counsel coming. "I value your perspective, Archbishop. These decisions, they're not made easier by the crown. Indeed not. But perhaps that's precisely why they matter so much. The monarchy has survived for over 1,000 years not because it avoided difficult decisions, but because it made them when necessary. Your mother understood this. She made painful choices about Princess Margaret, about the Duke, and Duchess of Windsor. The reference to his great-uncle, Edward VIII, who had abdicated to Mary Wallis Simpson, was pointed. That constitutional crisis had ultimately strengthened the monarchy by demonstrating that duty came before personal desire. Charles's grandfather, George VI, had never wanted to be king, but he had stepped up when called upon, helping to guide the nation through World War II. As evening approached, Charles found himself alone with his thoughts once again. The day's meetings had clarified the scope of the challenge, but they had also reinforced what he already knew in his heart. The institution he now led was bigger than any individual, including members of his own family. The crown that sat in the Tower of London represented centuries of tradition, sacrifice, and service. It was his duty to preserve that legacy for future generations. The phone call he dreaded came just after dinner. Andrew's voice, when Sir Clive connected the call, sounded defensive and slightly desperate. Word had clearly reached him about the day's discussions and the increasing pressure for action. "Charles, surely you're not seriously considering these ridiculous demands from the press," Andrew began without greeting. "We're brothers. We're family. You can't just abandon me because of some newspaper hysteria." Charles closed his eyes, feeling every one of his 75 years. "Andrew, this isn't about abandonment. This is about the survival of the institution we both serve." "Serve?" Andrew's voice rose in anger. "I've served this family my entire life. I've fought in a war for this country. I've undertaken thousands of royal engagements. And now, because of some unfair allegations and a hostile media, you're ready to throw me aside." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, touching on decades of shared history, childhood memories, and family bonds. Andrew reminded Charles of their mother's support, of how she had stood by him through previous scandals. He spoke about his daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, and how this would affect their positions within the royal family. But Charles had made his decision. The weight of the crown, the advice of his counselors, the needs of the institution, and the clear direction of public opinion all pointed in the same direction. The monarchy's survival required painful sacrifice, and Andrew had become that sacrifice. "I'm sorry, Andrew," Charles said finally, his voice heavy with emotion. "But I've made my decision. You'll need to step back from all royal duties permanently. The arrangements for Royal Lodge, we'll need to discuss those as well." The silence that followed was deafening. When Andrew finally spoke, his voice was cold and bitter. "You'll regret this, Charles. This family has survived for centuries by sticking together. You're setting a precedent that will come back to haunt the monarchy." After the call ended, Charles sat in his study until well past midnight, staring at the portrait of his mother that hung above the fireplace. Queen Elizabeth II looked back at him with the steady gaze that had guided the nation for 7 decades. He wondered what she would think of the decision he was about to announce to the world. The next morning would bring meetings with senior government officials, formal statements to be prepared, and the beginning of what would undoubtedly be the most controversial royal decision in decades. But tonight, King Charles III had crossed a Rubicon from which there would be no return. The die was cast, and the House of Windsor would never be the same. Outside his window, the first light of dawn began to creep across the ancient grounds of Windsor Castle, illuminating a new chapter in the long and complex history of the British monarchy. A chapter that would begin with one of the most difficult decisions a brother and king had ever been forced to make. The storm gathers. The Privy Council meeting convened at precisely 9 o'clock on a gray Tuesday morning in March 2024, behind the imposing doors of Buckingham Palace. The assembled councillors, including the Prime Minister, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and several senior civil servants, wore expressions that ranged from solemn determination to barely concealed anxiety. King Charles entered the ornate meeting room with the measured pace of a man who had spent sleepless nights weighing an impossible decision. Sir Clive Alderton had prepared meticulously for this moment, knowing that every word spoken and every decision made would be scrutinized by historians for generations to come. The agenda was brief, but momentous. The formal discussion of Prince Andrew's removal from all royal duties and privileges, including his residence at Royal Lodge. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak spoke first, his voice carefully modulated to convey both respect for the royal family and the urgent need for action. "Your Majesty, the government's position remains clear. The ongoing situation with the Duke of York has become a constitutional concern. Public confidence in the monarchy has reached critically low levels, and our polling data suggests immediate action is necessary to prevent further erosion of support." Charles listened intently, his fingers drumming silently on the polished table. The numbers Sunak presented painted a stark picture. Public approval for the monarchy had dropped below 40% for the first time in decades, with Andrew's continued presence cited as the primary factor in multiple independent polls. More concerning still were the constitutional implications. Several Commonwealth realms were beginning to question their continued relationship with the crown. The Archbishop of Canterbury leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority. Your Majesty, from a spiritual perspective, this decision represents an opportunity for redemption through accountability. The institution of monarchy has always been strengthened by its ability to acknowledge mistakes and take corrective action. Lord Chamberlain Baron Parker, who had served the royal household with distinction for over a decade, presented the practical considerations. The question of Royal Lodge is particularly complex, Your Majesty. The property represents a significant financial burden to the Crown Estate, and the Duke's continued residence there sends a message that royal privileges remain intact despite the circumstances. Charles had spent considerable time reviewing the financial arrangements surrounding Royal Lodge. Andrew had signed a 75-year lease on the property in 2003, agreeing to pay approximately £250,000 annually in rent, along with maintenance costs. However, the actual value of maintaining the 31-room mansion far exceeded what Andrew paid, effectively meaning the Crown was subsidizing his lifestyle to the tune of millions of pounds each year. The meeting continued for over 2 hours, with each advisor presenting their perspective on the unprecedented decision. Constitutional experts explained the legal mechanisms for removing royal titles and privileges, while security officials outlined the implications of withdrawing royal protection. The consensus was unanimous. Decisive action was not just advisable. It was essential for the monarchy's survival. Following the Privy Council meeting, Charles faced what he knew would be one of the most difficult conversations of his life. Princess Anne had requested a private audience, and her presence in his study that afternoon brought both comfort and additional pressure. His sister had always been known for her directness, and Charles suspected she would not mince words about the family implications of his decision, and settled into her chair with characteristic no-nonsense efficiency. At 73, she remained one of the hardest-working members of the royal family, undertaking more official engagements than almost any other royal. Her perspective carried particular weight because of her reputation for putting duty above personal considerations. Charles, I need to speak plainly about what you're contemplating, and began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never shied away from difficult truths. Andrew is our brother, but he's also become a liability that threatens everything our mother spent 70 years building. Charles appreciated his sister's characteristic bluntness. You support the decision, then? I support the monarchy, and replied firmly. And sometimes supporting the monarchy means making choices that hurt personally but serve the greater good. Mother understood this. She stripped Andrew of his military titles and patronages when the scandal first erupted. You're simply completing what she began. Their conversation turned to the practical implications for the family. Andrew's daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, would undoubtedly be affected by their father's further ostracization. Both young women had largely stayed above the controversy, maintaining their own careers and public profiles while supporting their father privately. The decision would inevitably impact their positions within the royal family structure, and addressed this concern directly. Beatrice and Eugenie are intelligent young women who understand the realities of royal life. They've watched their father's situation deteriorate for years. They'll adapt, just as the family always has during times of crisis. The next phase of Charles's consultation process involved meeting with his eldest son, William, whose perspective as heir to the throne carried enormous significance. William arrived at Windsor Castle that evening accompanied by Catherine, a decision that underscored the seriousness of the situation. As future king and queen consort, their views on family matters had taken on constitutional importance. The three of them gathered in the private sitting room that had once been Queen Elizabeth's favorite retreat. The room, with its comfortable furnishings and personal photographs, seemed to embody the tension between the public and private aspects of royal life that Charles was struggling to navigate. William spoke with the measured tone of someone who had given considerable thought to the subject. Father, Catherine, and I have discussed this extensively. We understand the personal cost of what you're contemplating, but we also understand the cost of inaction. The monarchy's future depends on its ability to demonstrate moral leadership and accountability. Catherine, who had largely remained silent on family controversies throughout her years as a royal, chose her words carefully. The children are beginning to understand the complexities of royal life. They need to see that actions have consequences, even within our family. Especially within our family. Their concerns extended beyond immediate family dynamics to the broader question of royal relevance in the 21st century. William had spent years modernizing his approach to royal duties, focusing on mental health, environmental issues, and social justice. Andrew's ongoing presence undermined these efforts by reinforcing outdated stereotypes about royal privilege and entitlement. The conversation turned to the timing of any announcement. Charles's advisors had recommended swift action to prevent further media speculation and public criticism. However, the family considerations were complex. Andrew's ex-wife, Sarah Ferguson, who still lived at Royal Lodge despite their divorce decades earlier, would also be affected by any changes to the living arrangements. William raised another crucial point. Uncle Andrew needs to understand that this isn't a negotiation. The decision has been made, and any attempt to fight it publicly will only make the situation worse for everyone involved. As the meeting concluded, Charles felt a profound sense of isolation despite being surrounded by family and advisors. The crown had always been described as lonely, but he was beginning to understand the true meaning of that phrase. Every decision carried consequences not just for him personally, but for an institution that predated him by centuries and would hopefully survive for centuries more. The following morning brought an unexpected development that would complicate Charles's carefully laid plans. Andrew had scheduled a meeting with his own legal advisors, and word had leaked to several prominent royal correspondents that he was considering challenging any decision to remove him from Royal Lodge. The prospect of a public legal battle between the king and his brother represented a constitutional nightmare that could damage the monarchy far beyond the current scandal. Sir Clive Alderton convened an emergency meeting with the king's legal team to address this new development. The king's council, who served as constitutional advisors, were unanimous in their assessment. A public legal challenge would be catastrophic for the monarchy's reputation, regardless of the eventual outcome. Your Majesty, explained Sir James Eadie, the senior legal advisor, while the Crown has clear legal authority to make these decisions, a protracted court battle would provide a platform for every grievance and allegation to be aired publicly. The media coverage alone would be devastating. The legal implications were complex but clear. Andrew's lease on Royal Lodge was ultimately subject to the Crown's authority, and the king had absolute discretion over royal titles and privileges. However, Andrew could potentially challenge the decisions on various grounds, including alleged breach of contract or even human rights violations related to his right to family life. Charles found himself facing a chess match with his own brother, where every move had to be calculated not just for its immediate effect, but for its long-term implications for the monarchy. Andrew's potential legal challenge represented a desperate attempt to maintain his position, but it also demonstrated exactly why decisive action was necessary. The afternoon brought another crucial meeting, this time with representatives from the major Commonwealth realms. The video conference included officials from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, all of whom had been following the Andrew situation with growing concern about its impact on their own relationships with the Crown. The Canadian representative spoke first, her message diplomatically phrased but unmistakably clear. His Majesty will understand that Canadian public opinion has been significantly affected by recent events. Prime Minister Trudeau's office has received numerous inquiries about the monarchy's future role in Canadian governance. Similar messages came from Australia and New Zealand, where Republican movements have been energized by the ongoing scandal. The clear implication was that the monarchy's survival in these crucial realms depended on demonstrating that it could police itself effectively and maintain the moral authority necessary for constitutional monarchy. Charles realized that the decision about Andrew had implications far beyond family dynamics or even British public opinion. The choice he made would determine whether the Commonwealth realms maintained their connection to the crown or began the process of severing those ancient ties. The stakes could not have been higher. As evening fell over Windsor Castle, Charles stood once again at his study window, watching the lights of the nearby town of Windsor twinkle in the distance. Those lights represented millions of people whose lives were, in some small way, affected by the decisions made within the castle walls. The weight of their expectations, combined with the constitutional requirements of his position, had crystallized his resolve. The phone call to Andrew would come the next morning. There would be no more delays, no more consultations, no more agonizing over the personal cost. The king had made his decision, and the monarchy would finally begin to move forward from the scandal that had haunted it for far too long. But first, Charles knew he needed one final conversation with someone who had always provided him with honest counsel. He placed a call to Camilla, who was visiting her own family, to discuss the decision that would define his early reign and possibly determine the monarchy's future for generations to come. Hashtag the royal confrontation, the telephone conversation between King Charles and Queen Camilla that evening would later be remembered as the final moment before the point of no return. Camilla, speaking from her family home in Wiltshire, provided the emotional anchor that Charles desperately needed as he prepared to take the most decisive action of his reign. "Darling," Camilla's voice carried across the secure line with a warmth and steadiness that had sustained their relationship through decades of public scrutiny. "You know what needs to be done. You've known it for months. The only question now is whether you have the courage to do it." Charles appreciated his wife's directness, though her words stung with their accuracy. Camilla had never harbored any illusions about Andrew's situation or its impact on the monarchy. As someone who had experienced royal scandal firsthand during their own controversial relationship, she understood better than most how public opinion could destroy royal reputations. "The family will never forgive me," Charles confessed, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at him for weeks. "Andrew will see this as the ultimate betrayal." "The family will survive," Camilla replied firmly. "It always has. But, Charles, the monarchy might not survive if you continue to delay. You've seen the polling numbers. You've heard from the Commonwealth realms. How much more evidence do you need?" Their conversation continued for over an hour, touching on the practical arrangements that would need to be made and the media strategy that would be crucial to managing the announcement. Camilla's experience with public relations, gained during their own difficult period in the 1990s, had taught her valuable lessons about timing and messaging. "You need to frame this as decisive leadership, not family abandonment," she advised. "The public needs to see a king who puts duty above personal relationships." "It's exactly what your mother would have done." The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with early spring sunshine streaming through the tall windows of Windsor Castle. Charles had requested that all meetings be cleared from his schedule until noon, knowing that the conversation with Andrew could not be rushed or interrupted. Sir Clive had arranged for the call to be placed from the king's private study, ensuring complete privacy for what would undoubtedly be a painful family confrontation. At precisely 10 o'clock, the secure line connected Charles with his brother at Royal Lodge. Andrew's voice, when he answered, carried a note of wariness that suggested he understood the gravity of the situation. "Charles, I hope you've reconsidered this madness about forcing me from my home," Andrew began without preamble. "I've been speaking with my lawyers, and they're confident that any attempt to evict me would face serious legal challenges." The king felt his jaw tighten at his brother's combative tone. This was exactly the approach that had gotten Andrew into trouble in the first place. The assumption that royal status provided immunity from consequences and that legal maneuvering could substitute for accountability. "Andrew, this isn't a negotiation," Charles replied, his voice carrying the full authority of the crown. "The decision has been made. You will vacate Royal Lodge within 60 days, and your remaining royal privileges will be formally withdrawn. This is not a request." The silence that followed stretched for nearly 30 seconds, filled with the weight of decades of brotherhood and the collapse of a relationship that had once been central to both men's lives. When Andrew finally spoke, his voice was cold with barely controlled fury. "You're making the biggest mistake of your reign, Charles. I am your brother. I fought for this country when you were playing with gardens, and architecture. I have devoted my life to this family, and this is how you repay that loyalty." Charles had anticipated this response and steeled himself against the emotional manipulation. "Your service to the country is acknowledged and appreciated, but your recent associations and the damage they've caused to the monarchy cannot be ignored. This decision is final." Andrew's response revealed the depth of his desperation and his fundamental misunderstanding of how the monarchy had evolved since their mother's death. "Mother would never have allowed this. She stood by me through everything. She understood family loyalty." "Mother is no longer here," Charles replied quietly. "I am king now, and I must make the decisions that protect the institution she spent 70 years building. Your continued presence as a working royal undermines everything she achieved." The conversation deteriorated from there, with Andrew alternating between threats of legal action, appeals to family sentiment, and bitter accusations about Charles's fitness to be king. He brought up old grievances dating back to their childhood, questioned Charles's own controversial relationships, and even suggested that the king was being manipulated by advisors who had never understood the royal family. "You're destroying the monarchy to save it," Andrew said at one point, his voice rising to near shouting levels. "When the Republicans use this precedent against William or George in the future, remember that you set the example." Charles remained calm throughout the tirade, knowing that any display of emotion would only escalate the confrontation. When Andrew finally exhausted his arguments, the king delivered the details that would reshape his brother's life. "The arrangements are as follows. You will have 60 days to vacate Royal Lodge. Alternative accommodation will be provided at Frogmore Cottage, which is more than adequate for your needs. Your personal protection will be withdrawn, though temporary security arrangements can be discussed if there are specific threats. All remaining royal patronages and honorary military appointments will be formally revoked." Andrew's response was swift and venomous. "Frogmore Cottage? That hovel? You're trying to humiliate me, to reduce me to the level of Harry and Meghan before they fled the country. I won't accept this degradation." The mention of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, who had indeed lived briefly at Frogmore Cottage before leaving royal duties and moving to America, was clearly intended to wound. Andrew was suggesting that Charles was treating him like the relatives who had chosen to abandon their royal responsibilities. "The accommodation is suitable and will be provided at no cost to you," Charles replied evenly. "The alternative is to make your own housing arrangements without crown assistance." As the call continued, Andrew made several last-ditch attempts to change his brother's mind. He offered to withdraw from all public appearances while retaining his titles and residence, essentially proposing a form of internal exile. He suggested a gradual transition that would allow him to maintain dignity while slowly reducing his royal profile. He even proposed a public apology and increased charitable work to rehabilitate his reputation. Charles rejected each proposal firmly. His advisors had been clear that half measures would not satisfy public demands for accountability, and the polling data supported complete removal rather than partial sanctions. The monarchy's credibility depended on demonstrating that royal status did not provide immunity from consequences. The conversation's most painful moment came when Andrew brought up his daughters. "What am I supposed to tell Beatrice and Eugenie? That their father has been cast out by his own brother? You're destroying their relationship with the family they've served faithfully." Charles felt this blow deeply, as Andrew had intended. Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie had indeed maintained their dignity throughout their father's scandal, continuing their royal duties and charitable work while avoiding any hint of controversy. Their positions within the royal family would inevitably be affected by their father's exile. "Beatrice and Eugenie will always be welcome as members of the family," Charles replied carefully. "This decision concerns you alone, not them. They can continue their royal roles if they choose, though their status will necessarily reflect the changed circumstances." The implications were clear. While Andrew's daughters would not be formally punished for their father's actions, their positions within the royal hierarchy would be diminished. They would likely lose their official royal protection and see their roles in state ceremonies reduced, though they could maintain their charitable work and some ceremonial functions. As the call neared its end, Andrew made one final appeal that revealed the depth of his disconnection from reality. "Charles, we can fix this. I can rehabilitate my reputation. Give me 2 years to prove that I can be an asset to the monarchy again. Don't make a permanent decision based on temporary public opinion." Charles realized in that moment that Andrew truly did not understand the severity of his situation or the permanent damage his associations had caused. The idea that public opinion about the Jeffrey Epstein scandal was temporary demonstrated a fundamental misreading of how modern society viewed such serious allegations. "This decision is final and non-negotiable," Charles stated with absolute finality. "You have 60 days to make the necessary arrangements. Sir Clive will coordinate with your staff regarding the logistics." Andrew's final words before ending the call were delivered with icy formality. "Your Majesty, you will regret this decision for the rest of your reign. History will judge you harshly for abandoning family in favor of public opinion polls." The line went dead, leaving Charles alone in his study with the weight of what he had just accomplished. The conversation had been as difficult as he had anticipated, but it had also clarified something important. Andrew remained fundamentally unrepentant and unwilling to acknowledge the severity of his situation. That confirmation made Charles's decision feel not just necessary, but inevitable. Sir Clive appeared in the doorway within minutes, having waited nearby in case the conversation required immediate follow-up action. His expression was carefully neutral, but Charles could see the relief in his private secretary's eyes. The Duke's response, "Your Majesty?" As expected, Charles replied wearily. "He's threatening legal action and refusing to accept the reality of his situation. We need to accelerate our preparations for the public announcement." The next few hours brought a flurry of activity as the royal household implemented plans that had been months in preparation. Press statements were finalized, government officials were briefed, and Commonwealth representatives were given advance notice of the announcement. The machinery of modern royal public relations swung into action with the precision that had been honed over decades of managing royal crises. Meanwhile, at Royal Lodge, Andrew was beginning to comprehend the full scope of his changed circumstances. The 31-room mansion that had been his sanctuary for over 2 decades would soon become just another memory. The gardens where he had entertained foreign dignitaries and business associates would pass to someone else's care. The life of privilege and status that he had assumed was his birthright was ending with a single phone call from his brother. As afternoon turned to evening at Windsor Castle, Charles found himself reflecting on the conversation that had just reshaped the royal family forever. He thought about their childhood together, about Andrew's genuine service in the Falklands War, about the moments of brotherhood that had sustained their relationship through earlier scandals and family tensions. But he also thought about the institution he now led, about the millions of people who looked to the monarchy for moral leadership, and about the future kings and queens who would inherit whatever legacy his decisions created. The crown that sat in the Tower of London represented something far greater than any individual family relationship, and today he had proven that he understood that fundamental truth. The royal reckoning was complete. Tomorrow would bring the public announcement that would shock the nation and reshape the House of Windsor forever. But tonight, King Charles III had demonstrated that the monarchy was still capable of policing itself and holding even its most privileged members accountable for their actions. The die had been cast, and there would be no turning back from the path that Charles had chosen for his reign and his family. The Royal Exile. The announcement came at precisely 11 o'clock on a Thursday morning in late March 2024, delivered with the formal gravity that accompanied all major royal proclamations. Buckingham Palace's ornate press room was packed beyond capacity, with journalists from around the world crammed into every available space. The statement, read by Sir Clive Alderton in his capacity as the King's private secretary, was brief but devastating in its finality. His Majesty the King has decided that the Duke of York will relinquish his remaining royal privileges and vacate Royal Lodge within 60 days. This decision reflects His Majesty's commitment to maintaining the highest standards of conduct within the royal family and preserving public confidence in the monarchy. The questions that followed came in a torrent, each journalist trying to extract additional details about the unprecedented royal exile. Sir Clive, following carefully prepared guidance, declined to elaborate on the specific reasons for the decision or the personal dynamics within the royal family. The message was clear. This was a matter of institutional necessity, not family drama. Within hours, the story dominated every news channel and newspaper front page across Britain and the Commonwealth. The BBC interrupted its regular programming for special bulletins, while Sky News launched continuous coverage with constitutional experts and royal correspondents dissecting every aspect of the announcement. Social media exploded with reactions ranging from triumphant approval to shocked disbelief. At Royal Lodge, Andrew watched the coverage with a mixture of fury and disbelief. Despite his brother's clear warnings, he had somehow maintained hope that the situation might be resolved through private negotiation or that Charles would reconsider the severity of the punishment. The public nature of the announcement felt like a final humiliation, a demonstration that he truly had no remaining power or influence within the family hierarchy. Sarah Ferguson, Andrew's former wife who had continued to share Royal Lodge despite their divorce decades earlier, found herself caught in the crossfire of a decision that would uproot her life as well. Known to the press as Fergie, she had rebuilt her reputation after her own scandals in the 1990s and had been living quietly at the estate while pursuing her writing career and charitable work. The logistics of Andrew's exile proved complex in ways that palace officials had anticipated but hoped to manage discreetly. Royal Lodge had been Andrew's home for 21 years, and the accumulation of personal possessions, official gifts, and family memorabilia represented a lifetime of royal privilege. Moving arrangements had to be coordinated with military precision to avoid creating additional media spectacles. Frogmore Cottage, the property designated as Andrew's new residence, presented its own complications. The 5-bedroom house in Windsor Home Park had been extensively renovated for Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's brief residence, but it was a far cry from the grandeur of Royal Lodge. For someone accustomed to 31 rooms and extensive grounds, the cottage represented a dramatic reduction in status and comfort. The financial implications of Andrew's exile extended beyond the immediate housing arrangements. Without royal protection, which cost taxpayers an estimated £3 million annually, Andrew would need to arrange private security if he felt threatened. His income, already reduced by the loss of most royal duties, would now need to cover expenses that had previously been absorbed by the Crown Estate. King Charles, meanwhile, faced the immediate aftermath of his decision with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The polling data released within days of the announcement showed an immediate boost in public approval for the monarchy, with particular support for Charles's decisive leadership. However, the family implications were becoming increasingly apparent as other royals struggled to respond to the unprecedented situation. Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie found themselves in an impossible position, torn between loyalty to their father and their own positions within the royal family. Both women issued carefully worded statements expressing their continued love and support for Andrew while acknowledging their respect for the king's decision. The diplomatic language could not disguise the profound impact on their own futures within the monarchy. Prince William, as heir to the throne, felt compelled to publicly support his father's decision, though he did so with obvious reluctance when it came to the personal aspects of the family conflict. In a rare personal statement, he emphasized the importance of accountability and the monarchy's commitment to serving the public interest above personal considerations. The international reaction proved as significant as the domestic response. Commonwealth realms that had been wavering in their support for the monarchy expressed renewed confidence in the institution's ability to reform itself. The Canadian Prime Minister's office issued a statement praising the King's decisive leadership in upholding the highest standards, while Australian Republicans found their arguments significantly undermined by the demonstration of royal accountability. European royalty watched the developments with particular interest, recognizing that Charles had set a precedent that could affect royal families across the continent. The Swedish and Danish monarchies, which had already streamlined their royal households and reduced the number of working royals, saw validation for their own modernization efforts. Andrew's threatened legal challenge materialized within 2 weeks of the announcement, though it took a form that surprised even his own advisors. Rather than directly challenging his eviction from Royal Lodge, his legal team focused on procedural arguments about the withdrawal of royal protection and the formal revocation of his remaining titles. The strategy seemed designed more to delay implementation than to achieve outright victory. The legal proceedings generated additional negative publicity for Andrew, as court documents revealed details about his financial arrangements and lifestyle that had previously remained private. The revelation that Royal Lodge's maintenance costs exceeded £500,000 annually, far beyond Andrew's lease payments, reinforced public perception that he had been living at taxpayer expense despite his reduced royal role. Charles watched these developments with growing frustration, recognizing that Andrew's continued resistance was undermining the very objectives the exile was meant to achieve. Each court filing and media appearance by Andrew's representatives reinforced the narrative of royal entitlement and refusal to accept accountability. The 60-day deadline for Andrew's departure from Royal Lodge became a media countdown, with photographers stationed outside the estate to capture any signs of packing or preparation. The visual symbolism of removal vans arriving at a royal residence would provide powerful imagery for news outlets around the world, transforming Andrew's exile from an abstract policy decision into a concrete human drama. As the deadline approached, Andrew made several last-minute attempts to negotiate alternative arrangements. Through intermediaries, he proposed extended deadlines, partial residence arrangements, and even the possibility of purchasing Royal Lodge outright. Each proposal was firmly rejected by the king's representatives, who had been instructed that any compromise would undermine the entire rationale for the decision. The actual departure, when it finally occurred, was managed with the discretion that befitted the gravity of the situation. No cameras were present as Andrew's possessions were loaded into unmarked vehicles during the early hours of a rainy morning in May. The man who had once been third in line to the throne and had served his country with distinction in the Falklands left his grand residence with only his personal belongings and fading memories of royal privilege. Frogmore Cottage, meanwhile, had been prepared for its new occupant with minimal fanfare. The property's gardens were maintained and basic security measures were implemented, but there was no ceremony or official recognition of Andrew's arrival at his new home. The contrast with his initial arrival at Royal Lodge in 2004, which had been celebrated as a sign of his continued importance within the royal family, could not have been more stark. The immediate aftermath of Andrew's departure brought unexpected consequences for the royal family's public image. Rather than the ongoing controversy that many had predicted, Andrew's absence from royal events created a noticeable improvement in the atmosphere surrounding official functions. Without the constant concern about his presence generating negative headlines, other royals found their work receiving more positive coverage. King Charles experienced this change most directly during his first major state visit following Andrew's exile. The visit to France, which had been planned for months, proceeded without any of the background noise about royal scandals that had plagued previous international engagements. French officials, who had previously expressed private concerns about Andrew's presence at diplomatic events, warmly welcomed the king and Queen Camilla. However, the personal cost of the decision continued to weigh heavily on Charles. Family gatherings became exercises in careful choreography, with Andrew's absence creating obvious gaps in traditional arrangements. Christmas at Sandringham, Easter at Windsor, and other ceremonial occasions required delicate navigation to acknowledge Andrew's continued family membership while respecting the formal exile from royal duties. The broader implications of Charles's decision began to emerge as other members of the royal family adjusted their own behavior to the new standards of accountability. Minor royals who had previously assumed their positions were secure began to exercise greater caution in their business associations and personal conduct, recognizing that royal status no longer provided automatic protection from consequences. Andrew himself gradually adapted to his reduced circumstances, though not without considerable difficulty. Friends reported that he struggled with the loss of status and the practical challenges of managing his affairs without the extensive support system that had surrounded him for decades. His public appearances became increasingly rare, limited to private social events and carefully selected charitable activities. The transformation of Royal Lodge into a conference center for the Crown Estate represented the final symbolic conclusion of Andrew's royal career. The grand rooms where he had entertained foreign dignitaries and business associates were converted into meeting spaces for government conferences and diplomatic receptions. The personal touches that had made it his home were erased, replaced by the neutral efficiency of institutional use. As the first anniversary of Andrew's exile approached, King Charles reflected on the consequences of the most difficult decision of his reign. Public approval for the monarchy had stabilized at historically high levels, Commonwealth relationships had strengthened, and the institution had demonstrated its capacity for self-correction. The precedent established by Andrew's case would undoubtedly influence how future royal scandals were addressed. Yet the personal cost remained significant. Family relationships that had survived decades of public scrutiny and private disagreements had been permanently altered by the demands of constitutional monarchy. Charles had proven that he was willing to put duty above family loyalty, but the price of that demonstration would be paid by multiple generations of the House of Windsor. The royal exile of Prince Andrew represented more than just the downfall of one controversial royal. It marked the emergence of a new model of monarchy for the 21st century. Under King Charles III, royal privilege would no longer shield family members from accountability, and the institution's survival would take precedence over personal relationships. The crown had survived another crisis, but the family that wore it would never be quite the same. As evening fell over Windsor Castle on the first anniversary of his momentous decision, King Charles stood once again at his study window, watching the lights of the town below. The weight of the crown felt different now, still heavy, but balanced by the knowledge that he had passed the first great test of his reign. The monarchy endured, reformed, and renewed, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring.